So welcome this evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name's Ben Caves. Welcome to the Cambridge Festival. I'm a senior research leader at RAND Europe. For those of you unaware, RAND Europe is a not-for-profit organisation whose mission is to support policy and decision-making through independent research and analysis. And we've been supporting the Cambridge Festival for over 10 years now, with our first event in 2011. So we're delighted this evening to be leading a discussion on the topic of societal resilience, what it means or what it takes for a society to bounce back from a crisis event, whether natural or man-made. Our panel this evening are going to be talking about what actions can be taken to improve or bolster society's resilience. They'll be highlighting examples and drawing upon lessons that we can learn from other nations who approach societal resilience in a slightly different way. Before I go on to introduce our panel this evening, I just want to draw your attention, I notice some of you have been reading it already, to RAND's annual review publication, Spotlight, which is dotted around the conference hall. Please do take a chance to have a look through that, because it's a summary of all our key research carried out throughout the year. So it's a good sort of snapshot of everything we've been involved with. And in particular, I'd like to draw your attention to page 36, which is effectively the work that we've done on tonight's topic of societal resilience. So please do have a look at that. So without further ado, on to the introductions. Kicking off this evening, we will have Becca Lucas, who is an analyst within Defence and Security Research Group at RAND. And Becca co-led our recent societal resilience study, which is in Spotlight in front of you. Becca will be handing over to Sir Ian Andrews, who is the Vice Chairman of the National Preparedness Commission. He's also a former second permanent secretary to the Ministry of Defence. And then we'll be finishing off with Stephen Baker, who's the Chief Executive of the East Suffolk Council, and he's also a Commissioner on the National Preparedness Commission. Each of our panellists will be drawing upon recent research, their own experience and expertise to discuss how whole of society, including national government, UK armed forces, emergency services, local government and the general public, such as yourselves, can support or have a role to play in societal resilience. So very pertinent to everybody, particularly with some of the issues that have been going on in the and events that have been going on in the news recently. We'll finish off after the presentations with a short question and answer panel discussion. And this will be your opportunity to ask questions of our panellists. So please do take the opportunity to ask any questions you want, pick their brains, and hopefully we'll get a healthy discussion going about what it means for societal resilience, what it means for yourselves. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to our first speaker, Becca Lucas from RAND. Becca, over to you.
Thank you, Ben. Hello, everybody. As Ben mentioned, my name is Becca. I'm an analyst in defense and security at RAND, and I was the co-leader of our recent project on enhancing defense's contribution to societal resilience in the United Kingdom. Tonight, I'm going to give you a broad overview of what societal resilience is, what it includes, and then the other speakers will fill in and build with their experiences, their firsthand experience on the overview that I will hopefully provide. If we look at the headlines, there are lots of challenges facing communities and governments around the world. That's not a surprise to anybody. Brush fires in Australia, flooding in the UK, infrastructure failure in Texas due to winter storms, and of course the COVID-19 pandemic. There are also less acute but ongoing challenges such as the cost of living crisis that is growing in this country. What Russia has done and is doing in Ukraine as well has raised a whole new set of concerns for many of us. Climate change is only going to increase the frequency and potentially severity of natural disasters. And of course, there will be new and unexpected challenges that societies, governments, communities, individuals will need to respond to. Societal resilience is part of thinking about how we confront these challenges and how we move forward in the face of such difficulties. There are a lot of definitions of resilience in colloquial use or in government, and this can make it difficult to measure or quantify what we mean when we say that a country is resilient or an individual is resilient. even within the UK, across different governments, but across different policy documents within the UK government, resilience is difficult to define. It's difficult to kind of nail it down. Typically, though, it refers to what Ben was saying, the ability to absorb the impact of a crisis and recover from it and rebuild. This can be true on a community level, a personal level, or an international level. You can say a person might be resilient or a community. When we talk about societal resilience, we're talking not just about the ability of a community, but the ability of a country to be able to respond, to absorb, and build back after crisis. This includes, of course, the people in the country, but also includes things like critical infrastructure, government structures, government's ability to provide basic services, and maintain public order. There are both physical and psychological aspects of societal resilience as well. So you have things like making sure that the roads work and are repaired, and making sure that the electrical grid is still working. And then you have people who are affected by crisis, whether they've experienced trauma, whether they have the ability to continue to operate as they would normally, or whether they need to take time to step away from the world for a bit, something I think we've all become familiar with during the course of the pandemic. In recent months, RAND has done a lot of work on different aspects of resilience, as Ben has alluded to. I was involved in the study all the way to the left that involved, but all of these studies have involved desk research, interviews, workshops, focus groups with practitioners, academics, and people from across different types of organizations, the public and the private sector, who were involved in this kind of work. Often, because RAND comes at, because of our team at RAND is a defense and security team, we start coming at this from a defense perspective or a national security perspective. But it has quickly become clear in every project that we've done that no one government department can tackle these challenges alone. No government, even in isolation, can tackle these challenges alone. So it's an issue that cuts across different areas of government. And one thing you'll hear me say a number of times is that, again, this need to work together among government, but also for government to collaborate with the private sector, with third sector organizations and nonprofits, and with individuals and communities is paramount in order to ensure societal resilience. Much of RAND's work has been commissioned on behalf of the government, primarily the UK, but also a bit in the US. This is in part because the UK has recognized the importance of societal resilience. The integrated review recognized resilience as a priority, describing it as the result of effective and trusted government, social cohesion, and individual and business resilience. The rapid changes in the threat environment and the unpleasant surprises of recent years have reinforced this need to not just respond to and be prepared for specific types of threats, but also have the ability to respond to threats that we don't know are coming, and to be resilient and to be able to absorb the impact of those threats. The US National Defense Strategy, which came out in the last few days, also emphasized the importance of resilience, the ability to withstand, fight through, and recover quickly from disruption. Thinking about resilience also means a shift in how we think about threats or crises. We can't prevent all of them. Things get through. Things take all of us by surprise. So the question is then about how you limit the impact or mitigate the impact of those crises, fight through, and rebuild on the other side. And that's the importance of resilience. Doing so stretches across the responsibilities, as I mentioned, of multiple local and national stakeholders in government, public and private sectors, down to individuals who volunteer their time or donate food or other resource. For example, the UK military is involved in providing military assistance to civilian authorities, but can only do so at the request of local government or other government departments. To help think through all aspects of resilience, we've created a three-phase model. The three phases often overlap, and they can have cascading effects. So you might be recovering from one crisis while preparing for another at the same time. And the impact of one crisis might change the way in which you need to recover from another. We created this three-phase model particularly because one of the things that we kept hearing in our interviews was the importance of the third phase, recover. But it's the longest phase, often the most resource-intensive, but it's not talked about a lot in the literature because it's a long, slow process. And so this model helped us to think about all three aspects of resilience. Within each phase, we included a number of discrete tasks, so I'll run through them quickly. The prepare phase involves foreseeing, so thinking about what kind of threats are on the horizon, building capability, building capacity, building relationships, and then educating, so educating the public, educating different government departments about what their counterparts in other departments can provide, respond once a crisis comes, understand what's going on, inform both the people who can respond immediately, what's going on, inform other people who can bring resource and capability to bear of what's coming, and then mobilize, get people in place to, put up sandbags or run soup kitchens or whatever it is that needs to be done. Then for recover, there's an initial reset, so making sure that everybody has what they need to just get through the next few hours. Then there's regenerate, rebuilding capability and capacity, and then innovate, thinking about the lessons learned from this particular disaster and how we can respond better to the next crisis. We looked at how different countries think about enhancing resilience in different ways to better understand some of the things that the UK might be able to do. The 5 countries that we looked at, Sweden, Australia, Israel, Russia, and Colombia, all have different, respond in different ways and think about defense differently. Sweden is famous for their total defense concept. In Colombia, we saw that the nonprofit sector picks up a lot of slack where the government can't or doesn't have the resource to step in. But it's almost impossible to know what works and what doesn't, and which country is the most resilient. There are no standard metrics. And how do you measure how much worse something might have been if it weren't for resilience? How do you measure how much more it might have cost to recover from a disaster if you have no way of knowing what it would have looked like without that resilience? In addition, the variation between what countries need to prepare for is immense. Earthquake preparedness is not helpful in the UK, but snow removal is not needed in most of Australia. The needs of London or Norfolk are very different. So governments have different levels of capacity that they can bring to bear and need to be able to respond to different types of things, which creates a challenge because you can't just export a model that works in one place and place it on another. So we identified some good practices that we thought were important in the case studies. The first is the importance, as I think I've alluded to and as Ben alluded to, of cross-government coordination, that this is a job that requires partnership from across government, from all levels of government, national and local, and then partnerships between government and private sector and nonprofit sectors. More effective long-term relationships are a key way of building this cooperation and integration. Enhanced communications also is an enabler for this kind of coordination between government and its counterparts, but also between government and the population. Sweden does a really excellent job of communicating with its population about the kinds of things that would be expected from them in the event of a crisis, and thinking about how to make sure that the individuals in the population have the information that they need to get through a crisis and enhance societal resilience. Finally, exercises and rehearsals so that people know what to do. Again, Sweden is an example of this. They hold nationwide total defense exercises, but it can really be anything from fire drills in workplaces and schools to something organized on a local level. Exercises and rehearsals not only teach people what to do, they help build those relationships and those connections that can foster interdepartmental or other types of cooperation. And it can also reveal unintended consequences or challenges when you thought something was going to be there and it wasn't, or you thought you had an easy way out of a building, or you thought you knew how to find the Babbage Theater, and you didn't. So that concludes my portion of the presentation. I hope that's been helpful as an introduction to societal resilience as a concept, why it's important, why we need to think about it, and maybe provided a bit of food for thought. Sir Ian and Stephen will now build on that kind of that theoretical background through their experiences and hopefully bring this all a bit more to life.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you, Becca. The themes that you've brought out certainly resonate and are consistent with many parallel conversations in which I've been involved over recent months. But I think we need to remember that resilience is just a pathway. The outcome is better preparedness of individuals and of society. It's better preparedness of families, of communities that make up that society. And I wonder too whether we should not be more ambitious. Is it enough just to think in terms of absorbing and bouncing back from a crisis? Surely we need to ensure that we are all better prepared for the next one, whenever it occurs and whatever form it might take. The National Preparedness Commission was conceived actually ahead of COVID-19, with the aim of promoting better preparedness for any future major crisis or incident. It brings together some 50 leading figures from Parliament, public life, academia, business and civil society, including Stephen, and it met for the first time in November 2020. Its website provides a rich source of material, including the many reports and articles which have been commissioned and published since then. Its premise is that in an increasingly volatile and uncertain world, in which risks are increasingly complex and interconnected and can have unpredictable consequences, we all need to take resilience and preparedness more seriously. But the conundrum is that this needs us to try to predict the unknowable, prepare for the uncertain, while recognizing that with the benefit of hindsight, some of it will always prove to have been wrong. Now, this is actually quite hard for we humans. We instinctively find it easier to believe that something might happen if it comes easily to mind. An optimism bias predisposes us to be over-optimistic about the risk of something bad happening, and indeed overconfident about our ability to cope if it does, which can make it much harder to form sound judgments on how much effort to invest in preventing that low likelihood but high impact risk. For politicians in particular, faced with the choice between just in case and just in time, it can be all too tempting to kick the can down the road on the off chance that it probably is not going to happen in my term of office. But that begs the question, what should we prepare for? How much preparedness is enough? How do we finance the necessary investment? And what is the correct balance between resilience and efficiency, or just in case rather than just in time? And the unfortunate fact is that no one, no nation, no business has invested anything like enough in being prepared for crises, whether foreseen or not. In the town of Fudai in Japan, back in the early 1980s, the mayor was ridiculed for insisting on building flood defenses and a huge sea wall at the cost of many billions of yen. But he was vindicated in 2011, when the tsunami obliterated other nearby towns, but not Fudai. He had been long dead by then, but 3,000 residents owed him their lives as much as much else. As has been painfully apparent over the last couple of years or so, the cost of failing to prepare for an event far exceeds that of investment in better preparedness. That's not to say there hasn't been any thinking about potential risks, but it's not enough to just include them to be admired on the risk register unless effective plans are developed to respond when they materialize. Nor is that sufficient if the process is not exercised regularly with the involvement of all the right actors. Pandemic flu, for example, has been firmly at the top of the National Risk Register since it was first published in 2005. Since 2011, the pandemic flu strategy actually foresaw a reasonable worst case of 200 to 300,000 deaths in just 15 weeks. an order of magnitude greater than anything we've experienced so far with COVID. And it foresaw the NHS being overwhelmed by staff absence. But there was no mention of lockdowns, school or border closures, face masks. Indeed, some of them were explicitly considered and dismissed. The risk of new and emerging infectious diseases was identified, but it was assessed to be at low likelihood of spreading to the UK, where the impact might be of the order of just 250 cases over several months. Resilience is also increasingly recognized as a vital component of modern deterrence. By that I mean it's just one factor contributing to uncertainty in the mind of a potential malign actor, whether another state or not, about whether their ambitions can be achieved at acceptable cost. And nowhere, I think, is this more starkly evident than by the tragic events being played out in Ukraine today. What we prepare for, we deter. Now, many of you in this audience probably may not know that until the mid-1960s, we in the UK had something called civil defence. While specifically predicated as a response to a hostile state attack, it was run by local government and assumed responsibility for the whole gamut of tasks, including rescue, recovery, emergency housing, food distribution, and the care of the most vulnerable in the community. And as the RAND study has demonstrated, some nations maintain a similar capability today. But I wonder how much appetite there is for this in the UK today. Have we fallen into the collective mindset of assuming that whatever happens, someone, they, will sort it out for me? The way in which, during COVID, many communities mobilized to help themselves was evidence of what can be achieved in response to a crisis. But if we're genuinely all in this together, should we not all be involved in contributing to the debate, given the part that each and every one of us has to play while the sun is still shining? Arguably, we have a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to grasp, and the time to do it is now. The media coverage of last year's Integrated Review of Security, Defence, Development and Foreign Policy, to give it its full title, focused on big power competition and numbers of nuclear weapons. But one of the most significant commitments was to the development of a national resilience strategy in partnership with government, the private sector, and the public, and with the devolved administrations, the English regions, and, as I said, local government, and promising a whole-of-society approach, but that went virtually unreported. So too did the subsequent call for evidence to inform the new strategy by the then Paymaster General, Penny Mordaunt, in a powerful speech to RUSI in July last year, in which she urged the need for the national conversation that this would require. She went on to set out what such a strategy would need to address and what the government meant by a whole-of-society approach. Every one of us has a part to play. Although more than 1,400 submissions were subsequently received, including both formal and informal representations from the Commission, nothing further has been heard, and the promised strategy has still to see the light of day. Also in last year, a House of Lords Select Committee, chaired as it happens by another National Preparedness Commissioner, Lord Arbuthnot, and including a number of others in its membership, took evidence on preparing for extreme risks, building a resilient society. In its report, published in December, focused on what it had found to be the UK's total lack of preparedness and the need to challenge the culture of excess secrecy that was attached to the whole risk assessment and response process. If we do not know what the risks we face are, how can anyone be expected to prepare for them? They also found that there was too great an emphasis on responding to hazards after the event rather than preparing them for them before they happened. Went on to make a number of recommendations. The establishment of an Office of Preparedness and Resilience, led by a new post of Government Chief Risk Officer and supported by a standing expert advisory panel, a joint resilience and contingencies select committee, and an annual debate in Parliament. Placing appropriately funded local resilience forums on a statutory footing, fully integrating them with the private, voluntary and community sectors into the risk assessment and planning process. They recommended working with the insurance industry to explore how to manage and mitigate those risks which are just too big for the private sector to carry alone. They highlighted the need for regular exercising of risk plans against demanding scenarios, including involvement at the most senior levels of government. And they called for better education of the public, that whole of society, on the part that we all have to play in contributing to greater resilience and better preparedness. And only last week saw the publication of an independent review for the Commission by a team led by a former head of the Civil Contingencies Secretariat on the operation of the 2004 Civil Contingencies Act and its supporting arrangements. Based on more than 300 interviews with people on the front line of emergency response, not just to COVID, but to other emergencies that have happened over the last 20 years, it reached the stark conclusion that resilience had suffered strategic neglect over the last decade and made more than 100 recommendations for what needed to be done if the resilience of the United Kingdom is to be fit for the future. It too concluded that more effort needed to be invested in preventing emergencies arising in the first place and to designing resilience into communities, into infrastructure and into policies at both national and local levels. Its specific recommendations, again, you'll recognise some of the themes coming through. Investing in the skills of those involved in responding to crises to ensure that they're aware of their respective roles and those of others around them by rebooting the training system around a new Centre of Resilience Excellence. Creating those genuine partnerships, appropriately resourced, with all individuals, communities, businesses and voluntary organisations that will need to step up in a crisis. Publishing more information on risks and their consequences so that individuals, families, communities and businesses can be better prepared, and involving them in the development of appropriate policies and practices. Appointing what they called UK Government Chief Resilience Officer, with personal accountability for what is done to build UK resilience, supported by a single dedicated national body formally accountable for delivering greater resilience. And recognising the role of local government, and perhaps metro mayors in particular, and the role they have to play in delivering societal resilience. And finally, addressing concerns about data sharing, which prevent vulnerable people getting the support they need when they need it most. The issue of data sharing. This was the subject of it has already been the subject of another report for the Commission by Thames Water, which was the subject of a round-table discussion only 2 days ago. In any crisis or emergency, there is an urgent need to identify those who are potentially most vulnerable and in need of assistance. This information is almost always known, but in different forms, to local authorities and care providers, emergency services, utility providers, voluntary and community groups, families and friends, as well as the NHS. but there is no way of reconciling it or bringing it together before or even after a crisis hits. Data sharing in these circumstances is legal, does not require prior consent, because the purpose is to protect the individual and is in the wider public interest. And research has shown that most people welcome a proactive approach to tell it once if it enables them to have ready support to the relief that they need when they need it. But we have to find a way routinely to share this knowledge on a consistent and coherent basis to enable the various parties to plan their response before the crisis overtakes them. The technology to aggregate and mine big data is now available. It is complex and it can be done if there is a will. Whether it is for regulators, the government, or some independent initiative to stimulate it, or whether there should be an explicit duty to share in an emergency placed on all those holding the information, something needs urgently to be done to enable it to happen. Or too many folk, sadly, will not live to regret it. So, to conclude, there's some strong and consistent themes come through from all of these studies. I'll leave you with my summary of perhaps the most important ones, but you will have your own views. And whatever list you choose, that once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to transform the resilience of the UK and our preparedness for future crises is not, I'm afraid, going to last forever. Thank you. Stephen.
Thank you. Well, good evening, everybody. And as mentioned before, my name's Stephen Baker. I'm Chief Executive of East Suffolk Council. And I feel a bit of an imposter here this evening because we've got some great sort of academic and expert people on the panel here, and yet I'm a humble local authority Chief Executive. I'm Chief Executive of East Suffolk Council. East Suffolk Council supports or has a population of 250,000. It has 49 miles of eroding coast. As one of my previous directors, with a bit of a wag, he said to me once, he says, Stephen, he says, you're one of the few council chief execs whose district area will be significantly less when you leave than it was when you arrived. And we also host a number of other key pieces of national infrastructure, such as Felixstowe Port, but most of all, Sizewell Nuclear Power Station. So you'll appreciate my interest in civil contingencies, emergency planning, and so on and so forth. And tonight, colleagues, some of you may remember there's a comedian called Rowan Atkinson, and he did some various sketches and things. He does a sketch based on weddings, and he does one as the father of the bride, and he uses this line. He says, well, this evening, he says, I'm going to speak much as my wife sang during the service with no real notes. So I'm going to just talk through, if you like, the perspective of, if you like, community resilience from the perspective of the community, just to try and give that different angle, if you will. As Ian mentioned earlier, I am a member of the National Preparedness Commission, and they did do a document called Partnering with Purpose, and this is one of the piece I lifted out of it, but the bit that really pulled it together for me, colleagues, was that piece along the bottom there, where to create a greater unity of purpose. Because I do think that if we're going to be resilient, if we're going to start pull together as communities, we do need to create that greater sense of purpose, that unity of purpose. Ian's also already mentioned the review of the CCA in 2004. And again, I've lifted this section out. I'm not going to read it all through, although we've got plenty of time, so I could do. But again, the bit that really stuck out for me was where it said, and in communities, into a cohesive whole. And I have to say, it is quite a struggle to get those communities to pull together as a cohesive whole, but it is something which is going to underpin anything that we do in the future around that resilience, or that resilient piece, as explained by both Becca and Sir Ian. So that is, again, something which is being recognised in these documents, in these reviews, in these studies. But how do we make it happen from the bottom up? How do we engage with local communities to achieve that level of resilience? Again, that particular report referred to the Sendai framework. And I was privileged enough to go to Sendai in Japan some years ago to study what was happening in terms of emergency planning over there. And they, as you say, Serena, they do a phenomenal piece of work over there. The Emergency Planning Centre in Tokyo is something to behold. It's a massive thing, the size of a warehouse. And they're already primed. Every seat has a laptop, a high-vis jacket ready just in case something happens. We have nowhere near that level of resilience or preparedness, I would suggest. But they were saying, look, there's these 4 priorities. We have to understand the risk, the disaster risk. And I think Becca very usefully articulated earlier on that there's a difference in terms of understanding what the risk is that we're actually facing as communities. We need to strengthen that disaster risk governance to manage that risk indeed. We need to invest, and I think interesting the reference to the Mayor, in disaster risk reduction in order to achieve degree of resilience. And, of course, enhance our preparedness, and getting ready to build back better. And I have to say, from the community perspective, that recovery piece is the piece which really, really quite often matters. But there was that phrase at the bottom there, the substantial reduction of disaster risk and losses in lives, livelihoods and health, and in the economic, physical, social, cultural and environmental assets of persons. And this is the bit, colleagues, they put persons first. They didn't say it's about the big picture. They were saying, no, actually, it's about persons, businesses, communities, and then countries and countries. And I just thought that was a really interesting cultural perspective from their point of view. The UK government does refer to, as we know, community resilience. This is from the Levelling Up paper, or is it the other priorities paper? I can't remember which, doesn't really matter. Because it talks about community and place. And we thought, great, when we saw this, they're going to start investing in community and place. So here, this is something to look forward to. We can work with this. But then, and it said, to build resilient and safe neighbourhoods. That's what it says. So we thought, great, there's some resilience here. But then when we looked at the detail on this particular piece, it was communities and place, and it talks about graffiti and litter. And that's not what we want necessarily. Well, we do want some resilience about that. But you know what I mean? We want a much bigger picture around what the resilience is that we're going to be working towards. So getting that message through government is something which is a constant thing. And I don't know if Serena, you might disagree with me. I don't know. We'll find out later. But I think this is something which the National Preparedness Commission is almost finding itself forming to fill that vacuum, to sort of push that agenda, to make that point. So what resilience structures are there at that local level then, colleagues? Well, of course, there's the emergency services. And bear in mind, I'm looking at this from the point of view of the communities. And in terms of our local government, yes, we have a responsibility for emergency planning. We have emergency planning officers. We have emergency planning teams. We have rooms ready to become emergency response centres. Absolutely fine. There was reference earlier on to the local resilience forums. Well, yes, perhaps they should be on more of a statutory footing. There's no doubt the current government has given them more funding and given them more of a role. Sometimes it's unexpected when something comes through and they're telling the LRFs, actually, you're now going to do something on this, and they weren't expecting that. But I'm not so sure the LRFs are that widely known to our local communities. There aren't that many towns and parishes that actually know that an LRF is there and sort of has meetings and minutes and all that sort of thing. So I think there is a role in terms of making those structures at that local level much better known in order to enhance our resilience. There are other agencies. Interesting that the data sharing piece was done by Thames Water. And, of course, the voluntary and third sector do have a key role to play as well. But underpinning all of that are the communities. And if you're a community, like in my patch, whether you're Aldborough, Orford, or Thorpe Ness, and you're on the very edge of the sea, there are folk in Thorpe Ness who, they're quite a privileged lot in Thorpe Ness, to be honest. They're quite a bit of money to them. They're actually putting their own money into sea defences to the six-figure sums. They're actually pulling together in order to create sea defences to protect their communities and create that resilience. And that's That's quite something, but as I say, it is from that bottom up. But when we talk about communities, I ask you to tell me, what do you define as a community? Because sometimes we read stuff and it says, oh, such and such as a community, but is that, town or a village? Would you say that was representative of a community? In which case, in my patch, and I'm just one district council in the country, I have 178 towns and parishes in my area. They're great fun to deal with. Or is it a county? Because some people say, well, no, actually, let's talk about it on county basis. So that's fair. That's fair. You could say it's the community of Suffolk or the community of Wiltshire or whatever. Or is it a subset within a... Because if you go to Birmingham, does Birmingham have a community? Is it a single community for Birmingham? Or is it subsets within an urban area that are perhaps more regarded as communities? Or, as I've suggested here, perhaps a broader geographic grouping, whatever you like. But interestingly, is it a socio-demographic group? Is it that the community, is that the community that wants to be resilient, or what we're expecting to be more resilient? I pose this as a question because if we don't understand what people themselves see as a community, how can we expect to engage with them? How can we expect to co-produce with them what it is they're going to deliver by way of supporting resilience and making things happen in their local area, in their local patch? So now we go on to another stage, if you will, and the question is, it's a very simplistic question, colleagues. It's very straightforward. What is it that we are being resilient against? Now, most recently, of course, we thought about pandemics. Oh my goodness me, we're being resilient against the pandemic. Absolutely. So how have communities been resilient? Interesting, different definition of risk. Some people in the audience today are seeing the risk is there, so they're wearing masks. Absolutely. Well, spot on, brilliant. Others have said, no, actually, I can manage the risk a different way, so I don't want to wear a mask. But so what is the risk that we're actually being resilient against? I've put on here, we've got a case of avian flu just outside Woodbridge, so Gressingham ducks won't be on the menu for a while, but never mind. Or is it a localised traumatic event that we're looking to be resilient against? As I said before, we've got various bits of big infrastructure in our area, something which many people don't recognise, not because it's not a risk, but because it hasn't really occurred to them, is perhaps some sort of a black sky event. Or is it a cyber event? Now that, to me, a cyber event is just as much of a threat as anything else. You probably wouldn't think this by looking at me, but I'm getting quite old now. And I was responsible for the Millennium Bug response in my council that I worked in at the time. This was a quaint thing, round about the turn of the century, or turn of the millennium, when we were all thinking that everything was going to shut down, including traffic lights, hospitals, telephone exchanges and everything, because of the flipping over to the year 2K. Well, that's nothing compared to what potentially cyber could do. Are we being resilient against terrorism and warfare, or is it natural events like floods and so on and so forth? Again, I'm teasing this out and I'm labouring this point, colleagues, because if we're going to engage with the communities, we have to, A, understand what they perceive as being the risk, but equally broaden out their understanding of what the risk could be. There's no point somebody coming to me and saying, well, actually, Stephen, I want to work with you about being more resilient about flooding. And I'm saying, yeah, but actually, that's fine, mate. But what about the terrorist risk, which my colleagues in Thames House are telling me is increasing and we need to be more and more aware of? So we need to look at this from a community perspective. Becca mentioned prepare, respond, and recover. And I thought to myself, is that a golden thread? And I thought, well, actually, no, it's more than that. It's a thread of steel. And again, what is the ask of our communities in addressing those 3 points of reference? Prepare, yes, okay. Respond, yep, great. But the recovery bit is the bit that all too often is overlooked. All too often in emergency exercises, I'm going to share this with you, I do lots of emergency exercises, and for years, when we got to that recovery stage, people like the Office for the Nuclear Regulation and people like that would shut up shop, take the high-vis off and say, well, that's it, we're off now, thanks very much, good. And we would say, whoa, hold on, you've done the response to the issue, what about the recovery phase? Because that's going to go on for ages. And that's what we found with the pandemic, because the recovery phase from the pandemic is going to go on for months and years and years. We know that, and that's what we're going to have to try and address as we pull things together. But the recovery phase is the bit which is so significant to the local communities, as I say. So what role should they be taking? Because nobody's got more skin in the game in terms of recovery from something which has happened to their community than the community. If you go to Miyagi in Japan on the coast, they were hit by the tsunami. They had to completely rebuild their town. And they rebuilt it, and it's an interesting bit, because the mayor who decided to lead the recovery and all that, he decided he wasn't interested in consulting with people over the age of 60 about what the town should look like in the future. Because basically he said, by the time you've rebuilt it, it won't be yours anyway, will you? Because you're going to be, So he wanted to focus on people aged 20, 25, and 30, because he said it's their future that we're building on. They're the ones with the skin in the game. So what outcome do we need? Well, we're looking, to be honest, we need much better engagement with communities. We need to find a vehicle or means of engaging better with them. We need greater support and greater capacity, if you like, in dealing with communities and making sure that they are engaged in that way, giving them that voice. I would suggest that, I don't know about you, but having thought through just what I've been saying there, I'm hoping you would agree with me, we need an improved understanding of what the threats are, of what community resilience actually means, what societal resilience actually means at the sharp end amongst the people that are down there. And we need to support their action by local communities about preparing, responding, and recovering. But there are a number of challenges, I have to say. So, first one is sustainability. I've got a parish council, it's called Snape. Nothing to do with a Harry Potter character, although I think that's where she got the name from. Snape Maltings in my patch. The parish council chairman is an ex-policeman, and he's really into this. He loves it. He thinks community resilience is the best thing since sliced bread, because it gives them something to do. And that's great. So they're really on it. But when Tim retires as the parish chairman, what's going to happen then? Is it going to, or is it going to be sustained? How are we going to sustain this community response, that community resilience? It's critical. Is it led by one person? Are they a single point of failure? How are we going to get that consistency? Do we worry about consistency? Is it an issue? Do we worry if that community over there worries about being resilient and that one over there doesn't give a damn? Does that matter to us? Because they'll benefit from it. I mean, taking back the Japanese example. One mayor built flood defences, another one didn't. Well, so, I'll leave that to yourselves. Demographics is an issue in terms of community resilience. In my part of the world, over 25% of my population are over the age of 65. Because a lot of people come to retire in my area. So how's that going to have an influence on how resilient that community is? Actually, there's some real tough old birds, I'll tell you what. But also, is there anything that what's the scope? Is there anything that we don't need communities to engage on? I gave the list earlier on, but should we say, actually, do you know what? You don't have to worry about avian flu and that sort of bird. We'll deal with that. You worry about these sorts of areas of resilience. I do wonder whether there's a link that we can build with greater links with local businesses, because they have business continuity plans and so on and so forth. They've got an interest in communities being resilient, especially where perhaps their employment base is local. So is there something we need to be building on there? So there's a challenge there. And also, maybe there's an argument for some more mutual aid. We have mutual aid arrangements between councils. Why not between different communities? Why not get them to work together and perhaps spread the load in some way, shape, or form? As I say, these are very practical issues, colleagues. But these are the ones which people at the sharp end in the towns and parishes, the ones that we're expecting to deliver community resilience, really think about. So in conclusion, yes, of course, greater community resilience is needed. Of course, a whole of society approach is needed. But it's going to be such a challenge, such a challenge. It needs to be done with, not to communities. It has to be done with them. And that clarity, that understanding of the scope, I would suggest to you, is absolutely essential. We can indeed learn from others, particularly, and we've mentioned Japan a number of times. But we need an immediate start, but it's going to take an awful long time. So that's my few reflections on community resilience from a very granular perspective, perhaps. There we go. Thank you. Over to you, Ben.
Fantastic. Well, I hope you'll agree, three very different but equally worthy and important presentations to talk about the subject of societal resilience, a little bit of background theory from Becca, from a UK military perspective, some conceptual models about how we can approach resilience, a look at kind of societal resilience from the National Preparedness Commission perspective from Sir Ian, looking at sort of gaps and dearths in strategy and policy and where their role is at the national level. And then at the end there, Stephen talking about the role of community resilience and resilience planning and what we mean by some opportunities, but also some issues to do with how we can improve resilience planning at the local level. So I think really now we're going to have a bit of a question and answer session. So it's going to be very much driven by how many questions we get from you guys. But really, I'd like to open the floor to you and invite you to ask questions of our panel, and I'll sort of relay these over, and we'll see if we can get a discussion going. So would anyone like to go first, pose the first question on societal resilience? I'll do two, so I'll take yours and yours at the same time.
Thanks. So resilience is expensive, and we see it being ripped out all the time today. Examples like local police offices being centralised, copper phone lines being decommissioned, push for IT to be centralised in a handful of cloud providers. How do you bring communities with you to pay for the expense of maintaining a resilient society when we have the pressures that everyone knows about today?
That's a fantastic question. And I'll just add to that your question.
Well, one of the questions that I had was you talked about culture, Becca, at some point. And I think as well you maybe mentioned at the beginning that we always have this very optimistic state of mind. I know that you said you looked at 5 different countries. And I was wondering, did any of the studies look at the impact of different cultures in those countries on kind of their approach and how they felt about and the approach they took specifically? Was it a cultural thing, to resilient planning?
That's an equally really worthy question. So first of all, how do we bring our communities with us when resilience involves a lot of investment and money within a resource-strapped and constrained environment? I don't know whether, Stephen, you want to go with that one first?
Yeah, why not? I think absolutely fascinating question. First of all, I'd say there are some things you can do around resilience that don't necessarily cost too much. So I'm thinking in my patch, the fine folk of Orford, if there's a flood, they've already organised themselves. They know they're going to sort of decant people up to a certain area and so on and so forth. They've got those plans written. It's about somebody described it the other day as discretionary effort. It's something about people just putting the resource in, but it's not something which needs, if you like, loads of money. However, I think to really ramp up that level of resilience and demonstrate a degree of commitment from all parties, from all stakeholders, it does need that level of investment, if you like. So local authorities, perhaps, local resilience fora, people like that, yeah, if they had a budget which they could use to invest in perhaps some smelly small pieces of kit or equipment that would then support and enhance a local community, and particularly also perhaps give them some models to follow. Taking a slightly different example, we know that some councils now, local communities have a neighbourhood plan. Well, there weren't many that did it to start with because they were starting from scratch. But then once they've got a model to follow, far more now are building these things. So take that and translate that across into that community resilience sphere. I can see a parish council meeting and saying, look, we need to do something like this. Where do we start? But if there's a starter for 10 there, that investment, which is replicable, well, that's okay, would certainly help them start to get a foot in the door and build things. But I suspect you're thinking about the much bigger picture around that sort of community and societal resilience. And I think that's where it needs to be recognised, and investment certainly would save, if you like, I'm not going to talk money, but it was going to save effort, and it would provide a return on that investment in the longer term. So I think you're right, there does need to be a much greater investment at that level.
So Ian, have you got anything to add from the national level?
I alluded to the fact that there's this really difficult trade-off between efficiency and resilience, just in time, just in case. And I also talked about, the government's made this call in the integrated review. Well, interestingly, the integrated review, all of the publicity about it, as I said, was on big power competition, nuclear weapons, nothing about the national resilience strategy, or the national conversation that the government has called for. Where is this going to happen? How is it going to happen? Were you aware of it? How are you having the conversation? No, then you are. It's very easy for the politician making a resource allocation decision to say, well, keep my fingers crossed, it probably won't happen while I'm around. Well, what were we saying that about COVID? What we spent in response to COVID just on PPE was multiple billions. I'm not getting into the value for money issue, but huge quantities of your money spent on getting emergency supplies of the wrong type of PPE. Why were the stockpiles not there? Why were they not there? They weren't. That investment, when the sun was shining, would have avoided all of that response. And I think it strikes me that a lot of the Scandinavian countries have got this right. And Becky, you looked at some of these, I think. But they are all the time, they put it in the school curriculum about the importance of resilience, about what the responsibility on every individual member of society is to contribute to resilience by being better prepared, whatever the crisis is, for war, for pestilence, for space weather events, you name it. If people are better prepared, more resilient, they will survive. And ultimately, it's that resilience of individuals and societies which will make the difference in the long term. I saw something in the reported in the Times today, actually, that the Norwegian government has said to its population that they should be dusting off their Cold War bunkers. They should be thinking about, are they still available? Have they got stockpiles? Have they got 3 days' food? Have they got water and so on? Why? Because of a Chernobyl-type event. Because back in the last century, when that Chernobyl went off, the effect was felt all over Scandinavia and in the UK. Their response to that is, we've got these facilities, let's just think about it. Make sure you've got 3 days' supply of food, 3 days' supply of water. That's the sort of thing we're talking about. It doesn't need to be expensive. Mm.
It's interesting, isn't it, how we fail to prepare and we end up spending money in a crisis and we spend a lot more for it. So if you think of it in terms of resilience versus efficiency and an insurance policy, it's getting people to think about actually money up front may actually be a cheaper way of spending than if we have to spend money in a crisis. I think the PPE example is a classic example that it sounds like it's free money, but actually that would have cost a lot less had we prepared for that and had the stocks in place. No, thank you for that. On to the second question about the cultural differences between the 5 case studies. Becca, would you like to comment on that?
Sure. So I actually think the two questions have a lot in common. As Sir Ian was saying, one of the things that the Scandinavian countries do really well is share information with their populations. Of course, it helps if there's a very large imminent threat. So Colombia was another case where there are towns that are really prone to mudslides. And so those towns have a lot of preparedness energy going into making themselves resilient against mudslides. Obviously, I'm from the US, if you live in California, you're very prepared for earthquakes because you know that that's something that's coming around the bend. In Chicago, where I'm from, we do tornado drills at school. So it helps if there's something big and impending and scary. that you can kind of see. And that's where I think you get into this importance of recognizing what the risks are and understanding them and explaining them to people so that they can understand, oh, I'm not just doing this because someone told me to. I'm doing this because it's a few minutes out of my day, or it's a little bit of money here, but it's going to pay dividends down the road. And I think something similar goes for these kinds of investments, both on a small scale, but also on a larger scale when you're talking about critical national infrastructure and the cloud and telecommunications. People need to be better equipped to understand what the trade-off is. Because if they don't, how can they possibly make an informed decision? And how can politicians be expected to make the hard decision if they can't, if their citizens, the people whose votes they need, whose support they need, don't understand the type of decision they're being asked to make? So one of the things that we came across in the literature was this idea that the British public isn't prepared for that kind of information, isn't prepared to be told about the kinds of disasters that they need to be prepared for, about the kinds of measures they could take, like having 72 hours of food or water on stock, to be prepared. And I think coming back to what Sir Ian was saying about this unique moment that we're in, I think the pandemic, what we're seeing in Ukraine, this awareness of climate change and the disasters that are going to come out of that, means that we're in a moment where people are aware that these kinds of conversations need to happen and that this kind of effort and resource need to be expended. And so I think, taking advantage of that moment to engage and better understand these discussions and these decisions and these trade-offs, both on a local level and on a national level, is going to be a key part of getting there.
Can I give an example of the cultural difference, which I think really, I mentioned Japan. In Tokyo, they have a center where they can take people through a simulated earthquake environment so they know what to expect. And it's got sparks falling around, it's all in darkness and all this sort of thing, and you walk around, you're tiptoeing over bricks and all this sort of stuff. And about 250,000 people go through that simulated environment every year so they understand what an earthquake means when it happens. And I thought about that and I thought, brilliant, I'd love to bring that back home, a similar thing, and have just a building where I can turn the taps on and simulate a flood in a home. Because people don't understand the sheer devastation of what happens when you get that much water in your home. It goes in the plugs. But, am I ever going to get the funding for that? Talk about funding? Am I hell as like? But there's a cultural difference. And I think, I'm going to be a bit controversial here. I think the stiff upper lip thing, where don't worry, when it happens, we'll be okay. Dad's army, what the hell, bit of gaffer tape, we'll sort it out, isn't going to cut it anymore. We need to understand. We need to build a resilient society.
I think just picking up the point on copper wires, if Toby Harris, the chairman, was here, he's very focused on the effect of an electricity outage.
Yeah.
Now, we had it 40 minutes in August 2019, and the train stopped and everything. And by the way, there was a hospital, I think, actually in your area, which had an emergency generator. But when the power failed, they realised that no one had tested it for hundreds of years, and there was no fuel. I give up. But what Toby says is, look, if you have an outage for any period of time, you don't have copper wires. You're completely dependent on mobile phones, mobile communications. What happens when your phone runs down? What happens when the internet goes out? Do you have hard copies of all of your critical personal information? Do you have wind-up torches? Do you have wind-up radios? Do you have, 3 or 4 days of water stacked up? Do you have, in Sweden, you have to have 3 weeks' supply of food available? All of these things everybody can do, and they're virtually cost-free, and they will make you all the more resilient and better prepared, whatever the crisis is. And that is what, my understanding, the government has called for as this great national conversation. But all I can say is there's a deafening silence.
Absolutely. Do you have any other questions?
got one in the middle.
Yep, 2, 3.
Do you want to go next?
Oh.
I suppose it's sort of to do with exactly that. Like, how do we change that culture of that stiff British upper lip, that keep calm and carry on, to a more kind of prepared, resilient thing? And then how do we build in resilience to that resilience so that we carry on doing that for like 20, 30 years, 40 years, that we don't just give up the civil defence system that we had before?
Who would like to go first?
Well, we gave it up. 1960s, it's gone. But I mean, what can you do? You can actually ask questions. You can go on the National Preparedness Commission website. You can ask your councillor, your local politician, your MP. You know, what do you do? What happened to the National Resilience Strategy? What's all this national conversation going on? What are you doing about it?
Yeah. I think it starts with you. And I'll tell you, the reason I say it starts with you, because you're the age that you can make the change and start the change to make it happen. I'm far too old now, but you know, and my mum, who sort of lived with the war and all that sort of thing. I mean, I don't know about anybody else's mum, but my mum, when I say to mum, go to the doctors, and she'll go to the doctor, and the doctor will say, how are you then, Mrs. Godboll? And she'll say, oh, I'm all right, really. And you just think, oh, mum, you're ill. It's that stiff upper lip, because partly it's an age thing. But people of your age coming through and saying, no, actually, you know what, we want to be resilient. You are the change that needs to happen. So please, give it a go. And there's a question over there and there's a question over there. Sorry, I'm used to being in full council.
How could we integrate questions of political power, established power hierarchies and so on into this model? To be more precise, I mean, we discussed the COVID case and the fact that this country was not particularly well prepared when it comes to protective gear, right? But even less was it somehow prepared for leadership that would categorize COVID as the flu, even in its worst forms, right? The first varieties. And of course, it's not the UK only. I have to think of Donald Trump here in this context as well. So this is an actual risk that should somehow be integrated into any risk assessment model, right?
Mm-hmm. Can I just jump in? I think there are always going to be, I mean, you mentioned Donald Trump as someone from the States who clearly followed up on my promise to leave when Donald Trump was elected. That resonates. And I think it speaks to the importance of building this from not just a national government level, but building it through local communities, building it through individuals, so that even if there's a failure at the top, so that there's no one single point of failure, and even if the leadership from the top isn't coming through the way we would like, or the way we would ideally have, there are other centers of power, if you will, and centers of resource and effort that can push through and hopefully make themselves heard to the people at the top, but if not, kind of carry on and get done as much of what needs to be done as is possible.
Do you think there's a role for training our leadership? Do you think our leaders were prepared enough for the task of resilience or crisis?
No. There was a time, and I've been out of government for a decade or more now, but there used to be the war book, which ministers were engaged in on a regular basis, looking at a crisis. The counter-terrorism message processes for taking down hostile aircraft, they used to be rehearsed on a regular basis. But they're only valuable if the people who are going to be in the decision-taking positions on the day are engaged and forced to face up to those decisions and those choices. And I come back to my point, the government has called for a national conversation. Where is it?
Yeah.
Why are we not having it? Why, these are really, really important issues that need to be debated.
Yeah.
But they're not.
No, you're absolutely right. And I'm not from central government, but I do talk to some people from central government. And I don't get the impression that even government to government within cross departments are having that conversation. My understanding is, perhaps I shouldn't say this out loud, but when the pandemic was on and people were saying, well, let restaurants put tables outside on pavements, so then people can go and eat outside in fresh air and everything else. There were parts of government that were saying, oh yeah, you're just creating a very easy terrorist target by doing that, but nobody was listening to other people that were sort of trying to put other points of view. So I don't even think that conversation is going on within government, let alone outside of government.
Any more questions?
There's a lady right over there.
Hello. I'm holding a bit of curiosity, really, and a little bit of disappointment. Firstly, when you talk about building resilience, what I'm hearing is relying on systems and processes and structures that are not continuing to work. And when you're talking about building resilience, you talk about building community. For me, the curiosity is around the absence of encouraging people to develop human-to-human relationships in their local area. So my question to you is, where does that fall within building part of a resilient society?
I would say, if I may, I think that's absolutely fundamental to developing that community resilience. So in 2013, when we had a flood and the middle of Lowestoft was up to that deep in water, yeah, I mean, the leader of my council was the one who was driving around trying to ferry people from the rest centres back to their homes and so on and so forth. Another councillor was walking around with he was so desperate to help, poor chap. He had a thermos of tomato soup and he was walking around trying to offer it to people, and they were saying, mate, I'd rather get my wet carpet out. But yes, I think the future of resilient societies do depend on that community resilience, that contact between different parts of the community. You're absolutely right. Now, do we allow that to form naturally and grow, if you like, in a sort of an organic way, or do we give it a little bit of a nudge and try and get it to structure and get voluntary sectors to move? Now, I think where there's pressure, it is happening. So again, using a local example, there's a thing called the Thin Ice Project in Lowestoft, where trying to help homeless people not drop in. So but my worry is where there isn't a pressure, where there's not perceived pressure, there may not be the impetus to grow that resilience. And that's the thing where we perhaps need to intervene. And with greatest respect to the Somerset levels, they didn't expect to get flooded all those years ago. So I think you're absolutely right. There does need to be community, but I'll leave it to my colleagues as well.
Slightly coming back to that, there are models around the globe where communities are taking the courageous approach to do things in a different way, to build communities, to shift the balance of power, perceived power, knowledge and information from state institution to the community.
Yeah.
So the model, you say looking for the models are out there.
Yeah.
You just need to have the courage to go and look for them.
Yeah.
And then experiment.
Yeah, absolutely.
And if you look at the Civil Contingencies Act as it stands, it absolutely provides for this local focus within a national framework. And we saw in COVID how the community, 750,000 people volunteered for NHS overnight, food banks striking up, all of this other stuff. I was a local COVID champion, checking in with the public health team, with the local council once a week. The astonishing knowledge and understanding in the local public health team, who are there actually to manage infectious diseases, their connections with the local voluntary organisations, their understanding of where the vulnerable people were, the diversity of the ethnic communities. It was just astonishing what could be achieved. But unfortunately, the knee-jerk reaction when COVID arrived was to drag everything back into Downing Street.
Yeah.
And people I've spoken to in local resilience forums saying, this stuff that was coming down was obviously, no doubt drafted with the best of intentions, but not with the first idea about what the practical implications were in rural Sussex or Bradford or...
It was very nice, but we just put it over there and got...
Yeah, and you just get on with the job. And when then Whitehall said, well, why don't we let you get on with the job? There was, hurrah, yeah, we will, and then it started to happen. But there's just that sort of, and again, that's the sort of thing that needs to be in this national debate.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Because there isn't one size fits all. The centre doesn't know best. It's there to provide a framework and the resources for the local teams to get on and deliver it. And my lockdown activity, just a little anecdote, was writing up the letters that my father wrote to his family between 1940 and 1946. And his father was an air raid warden, and I came across the order of the day in May 1945 from the then Home Secretary to the ALP organisation saying, "You, the local authorities, rose magnificently to the occasion. You proved you could be trusted. Thank you. We'll call on you again."
Yeah.
Fantastic. I think on that note, I think we've come to a close in terms of our time. Sorry if there's anyone who didn't get a chance to ask a question, but what I would say is that's a neat segue to remind you that we're hosting some drinks and nibbles down at the University Arms Hotel, just by Parker's Piece. So please feel free to join us, and you can come along and continue the discussion. And as I said, we'll be there and happy to come and have a chat. So please, you're welcome. It's only 5 minutes walk from here. But I think you'll all agree, 3 very different presentations, but all equally valid to the issue and topic of societal resilience, and some really interesting and fascinating discussions and questions afterwards. So I hope you'll join me in thanking our guest speakers tonight, and put your hands together to thank them on our behalf. More than welcome.